the big European powers still kind of looming over everything. And then you've got international law and how all of that kind of comes together.
It's really easy to kind of fall into this trap of thinking that, like, okay, America's founding, it's a clean break from Europe, but the reality is much more complicated. These ties were never fully severed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to be exploring those connections, especially around treaties, wars, and slavery. Really kind of looking at how those elements shapes the earliest years of the nation.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, we have these incredible sources to help us, like historical accounts, legal documents. I mean, we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff here. And I think some of this stuff might really surprise you.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, for instance, everyone knows the American Revolution, right? It's all about no taxation without representation. That's like the slogan, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. Ready for this? Taxes were actually higher for many Americans after independence.
Yeah, it's one of the many kind of like ironies that we're going to uncover. The quest for peace sometimes actually led to practices that Americans had initially fought against.
It's like, be careful what you wish for. So where do we even begin to unravel this? Where do we start this story?
I think a good place to start is this idea that after the War of 1812, right, America entered a season, quote unquote, of profound peace.
Profound peace. Yeah, that sounds pretty idyllic.
Right, on the surface, it does sound pretty great.
Where's the catch? There's got to be a catch.
Well, when you really dig into it, this peace had two layers. On one hand, you have peace with Europe, right, like maintaining those treaties, especially with Britain and Spain.
Okay, so that's one layer.
But then there's this other layer, peace within its own borders. And that's where things get a little more, well, a little less peaceful.
So you've got external peace. You've got this maybe not so peaceful situation internally. What was going on within those borders? What did this peace actually look like?
Basically, it meant asserting really broad authority over anyone within its reach.
Oh, okay.
Citizens,
Yeah.
Native Americans, enslaved Africans. It was like, they wanted to be seen as legitimate. They wanted to be recognized by those European powers.
Right.
They wanted to be treated as equals. But to get there, they had to adopt some of the very same practices they had initially opposed.
So like those standing armies and those higher taxes, that's a pretty big irony. So how did this all play out when it came to America's early diplomacy? How are they navigating that world stage?
I think a really good example of that is the Model Treaty of 1776.
Yeah.
So Congress was basically trying to create this blueprint for how they wanted to be seen, on that world stage. They were striving to secure rights comparable to those of any European nation.
Okay, so they were trying to play by the established rules to gain legitimacy. It's kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them.
Exactly. They were trying to join the club.
Yeah.
And this is really key to understanding that shift from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution.
Okay.
A stronger national government was seen as absolutely essential for international standing. And of course, it was important for, actually fulfilling all those treaty obligations.
Right, those treaty obligations.
Which, by the way, often related to some pretty thorny issues, like loyalists and enslaved people.
So it's like this desire to be seen as treaty-worthy. It's having this ripple effect on domestic politics as well. It's all connected.
Absolutely.
So this is fascinating stuff, but where does slavery fit into all of this? I mean, you've got this whole web of international law, you've got diplomacy. How does slavery get woven into all of that?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really complicated.
Oh, I bet.
Because you have this paradox, right? Slavery was completely legal in the colonies under international treaty law, but in England itself, its legality was becoming increasingly questioned.
Wait a minute, so you've got the colonies upholding a practice that's starting to become controversial in the mother country. How does that even work?
Yeah, it's a wild situation.
Right.
And these international agreements were literally upholding slavery. Let's take the Spanish El Ciento, for instance. It was parts to the Treaty of Utrecht. It actually granted Britain the right to sell enslaved Africans in Spanish America. And to grasp just how entrenched this was, you got to look at the actual text. It allowed for the importation of 4,800 enslaved people annually.
Wow, 4,800. That's a very specific number and a very chilling number. So treaties were literally perpetuating the slave trade?
They were.
What about between Britain and the newly independent America? What happened there?
Well, the treaty that ended the American Revolution in 1783, it actually stipulated that British forces would withdraw without, quote, carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants.
Wow. Okay, so even in the midst of this fight for independence, slavery remains this massive, unspoken issue.
Yeah.
It's like the elephant in the room of these peace negotiations. Nobody wants to really address it head on.
It really highlights this deep, complex relationship between slavery, international law, and diplomacy in this period. And we can't forget about that growing abolitionist movement in Britain, and how that was impacting the colonies.
Right, so you have these competing forces, right? You have the economic and political interests that are tied to slavery, but you also have this rising moral argument against it. How did that tension play out?
We'll definitely delve into that a little bit later, but I think for now, maybe we should shift gears a little bit and look at the reality of warfare in this era. Because, we keep talking about this profound peace, but I have a feeling it didn't always match up with what was actually happening on the ground. So what did this, supposedly humane warfare actually look like? It definitely didn't. To really kind of understand those contradictions, I think we need to look at a specific example. We're going to jump over to the West Indies in the late 1700s and meet a woman named Lady Isabella Hamilton.
Lady Isabella Hamilton. Okay, tell me about her. What's her story? What does it tell us about this period?
Well, on the surface, her life in the West Indies sounds pretty lavish. She's got this luxurious estate. She's got this busy social life. Her husband is a successful lawyer. But beneath that glossy exterior, her world was built on, well, on the brutal reality of slavery.
Ah, okay, I see where this is going. So what happened? What makes her story so significant?
So a friend of Lady Bell's, her name was Janet Shaw, was visiting from Scotland. And in her journal, she notes how Lady Bell was always attended to by this young enslaved girl. Shaw even comments on the contrast between Lady Bell's, delicate complexion and that of the girl who's serving her.
That's a powerful image, opulence, privilege, right there next to the dehumanization of another person.
It really is like a perfect snapshot of the moral contradictions of the time. And Shaw, to her credit, didn't shy away from recording what she saw. Her journal entries detail, the punishments inflicted on enslaved people, the constant fear of revolt, and the rampant sexual exploitation that was just part of life on these plantations.
That must have been pretty jarring, to say the least, for someone coming from Scotland. I mean, to be confronted with that reality.
It was. Shaw really grappled with what she was witnessing, and she tried to kind of create this mental separation between what she saw as her own humane European values and the quote-unquote different rules she perceived in the colonies.
Right, like trying to make sense of this completely different world.
Exactly. But what's really interesting is that this whole idea of separate legal systems for slavery was already being challenged back in England.
You're talking about the Somerset case, right? I vaguely remember learning about that in history class.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That landmark case in 1772, it ruled that slavery wasn't supported by English common law.
Okay.
And this sent shockwaves through the colonies. I mean, it implied that slavery was only legal because of specific colonial laws, not some inherent right under British rule.
So it created this legal gray area. It's almost like the very legitimacy of slavery was being called into question.
It was.
How did the slaveholders in the colonies react to that? I mean, were they worried?
They were definitely concerned, and it actually made them even more reliant on the existing laws and customs within the broader European legal system, what was known as the law of nations.
The law of nations. So they were using that to defend the institution of slavery.
Exactly. It's like even as abolitionist sentiment was rising in Britain, those international agreements were still a shield for slaveholders.
Interesting. So it reinforces this idea that, the world was divided into these zones of law. Slavery might be considered abhorrent in England, but in the colonies, it's upheld by this completely different set of norms.
Right.
Okay. So we've been talking about humane warfare. I have a feeling that didn't always match the reality on the ground. Let's talk about war.
Oh, you are absolutely right about that.
Okay, good. I'm glad I'm on the right track.
Let's go back to the 7 Years' War for a minute. The British, even though they often portrayed themselves as, civilized in their approach to warfare, they engaged in some incredibly brutal tactics.
Can you give me an example? What are we talking about here?
Well, take the actions of the Duke of Richelieu in Hanover. After an agreement was broken, he authorized his troops to just loot and burn the areas they occupied.
Wow, that escalated quickly. I mean, that's pretty extreme.
It was. And Richelieu himself even acknowledged that, it went against his own character and the supposed, humanity of the French nation. But he justified it by saying that the, quote, laws of war allowed it.
So even these so-called rules of war, they could be twisted to fit someone's agenda.
Exactly. They were open to interpretation. And when those rules were, bent or broken, the consequences for civilians caught in the crossfire, they were often devastating.
We talked about the Acadians earlier, Ray.
The Acadians, yes, they are a perfect example.
I knew it.
They refused to swear an unconditional oath of allegiance to the British crown,
Okay.
and they were suspected of sympathizing with the French, and the British saw them as ungovernable and a potential threat.
So even though they weren't actively fighting, their neutrality wasn't enough to protect them.
Sadly, no. The British completely disregarded their neutrality and forcibly removed them from their homes. It's a really, really tragic example of how easily people could become victims, even when there were attempts to make war more, quote, civilized.
It's like the rules are there, but they're not always followed. And the people who suffer the most are often those who are trying to stay out of the conflict altogether.
Right.
So we've talked about the 7 Years' War. What about the American Revolution? I mean, I'm guessing it wasn't all, heroic battles and triumphant victories.
No, definitely not.
Hmm.
There were documented cases of American soldiers being denied prisoner of war privileges. They were treated like common criminals.
That's awful.
It was. And what's even more interesting is that some British commanders were actually more lenient. Like, they allowed captured Continental officers a certain degree of freedom.
Wow, so it sounds like the treatment of prisoners was totally inconsistent. It probably just depended on the individual commander's interpretation of those, air quotes, rules of war.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It highlights just how difficult it was to enforce these kind of idealized laws of war in the midst of all that chaos and brutality.
Okay, so we've talked about prisoners of war. What about the treatment of non-combatants during the American Revolution? Were there any situations that kind of mirrored what happened to the Acadians?
There were definitely some parallels, especially when it came to the treatment of enslaved people during the war.
Right, because both sides tried to use the issue of slavery to their advantage, didn't they?
That's right. The British saw an opportunity to weaken the rebellious colonies by offering freedom to enslaved people who joined their cause. And historians estimate that tens of thousands actually fled to British lines during the war.
Tens of thousands. Wow. So what did the Americans do in response to that?
They also offered freedom to some enslaved people who fought for their side, although on a much, much smaller scale. So, it's a morally complex situation for both sides.
Yeah, I can imagine. So even as the American colonies are fighting for their own freedom, the issue of slavery is creating these moral and legal dilemmas.
It was a huge dilemma. And it all feeds into this larger story of, contradictions and challenges as this new nation is trying to reconcile its ideals of, freedom and equality with its dependence on enslaved labor and, westward expansion into Native American territories. And it's a story that's deeply, deeply entangled with the legacies of European colonialism. So we've got this profound peace, but at the same time, you've got all of this conflict and tension bubbling beneath the surface.
Right.
It sounds like we're about to get to the heart of this American dilemma. What are some specific examples that can help us understand the lasting impact of this entanglement? I think one case that really embodies all these complexities is the First Seminole War. It took place in the early 1800s. And it really brings these key figures like Andrew Jackson, William McIntosh, and Millie Francis into sharp focus.
Wait a minute, is this the same Millie Francis we talked about earlier, the friend of Lady Isabella Hamilton in the West Indies?
No, that was Lady Isabella.
Yeah.
This Millie Francis was a Creek woman who found herself right in the middle of this conflict.
Oh, okay. Two different Millie Francises. Got it.
Right. And her story, along with the actions of Jackson and McIntosh, really illuminates the contradictions at the core of American expansion.
This is getting good. Tell me more about the First Seminole War. What does it tell us about where the nation is headed?
So the First Seminole War, it was this clash between, a rapidly expanding United States, the Seminole people, and the Spanish, who still controlled Florida at the time. It became this focal point for all the issues we've been talking about, like land disputes, the legacies of slavery, and these really complicated relationships between the U.S. government and Native Americans.
Okay, so it's like all these threads are coming together. Set the scene for me. What were some of the key events that shaped this conflict? Or what should we be paying attention to?
Well, Andrew Jackson, he played a pivotal role. I mean, he was a military leader at the time. Of course, he later became president. But he was really known for his aggressive tactics and his very firm belief in American expansion.
So Jackson was really the one pushing into Florida.
He was. He saw the Seminoles as a threat to white settlers and, to the institution of slavery itself.
Okay.
Remember, the Seminoles often provided refuge to escaped slaves, which, well, that really infuriated Southern slaveholders.
Ah, so this conflict wasn't just about land, it was about power and the future of slavery in this expanding nation. It's all tied together.
It is. And then you have William McIntosh, a Creek chief who, well, he chose to ally himself with the Americans.
Wait, so there were divisions within Native American communities about how to deal with the United States.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these were complex situations. McIntosh, he believed that cooperation with the Americans was the only way to, to ensure the survival of his people. And so he signed this treaty that ceded Creek land in Georgia, which, well, it just further inflamed tensions.
It sounds like things are about to boil over at this point. Where does Millie Francis fit into all of this?
So Millie's story is incredibly poignant. Her father, Hillis Hadjo, he was a prominent Red Stick leader who, I mean, he vehemently opposed American expansion. And he was actually captured and executed by Jackson's forces.
Oh, wow. So what happened to Millie? I mean, what happened to her and her family after that?
Well, they were forced to surrender, and they endured just incredible hardship. And there's this one striking anecdote about a Scottish soldier named Duncan McCrimmon who had been captured by the Red Sticks, before the war.
Okay, what about this Scottish soldier? What's the story there?
So during his captivity, McCrimmon, he developed this close relationship with Millie's family. And after the war, he actually returned to Florida and offered to marry Millie and take her back to Scotland with him.
Wow, really? That's unexpected. So did she go? Did she go with him?
No, she didn't. Millie ultimately chose to stay with her people, even with all the hardships they were facing.
It's a heartbreaking story, but it's also incredibly inspiring. So how did the First Seminole War end? What was the outcome of all of this?
Well, the U.S. claimed victory, of course, and Florida was eventually ceded to the United States. But this conflict, it had this really, really long-lasting impact on the Seminole people and on the relationship between the U.S. and Native Americans in general.
What were some of the consequences? What happened in the aftermath?
Well, for the Seminoles, it led to further displacement and this long and really difficult struggle to maintain their autonomy and their way of life. And for the United States, it really exposed the deep divisions and moral contradictions, within the nation itself as it pursued these expansionist ambitions.
So it seems like that profound peace we talked about at the beginning was more of an illusion than a reality.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The pursuit of peace often came at a really, really steep cost, particularly for those who were, already marginalized. Native Americans, enslaved people, those caught in the crossfire of war. And these entanglements, these contradictions, I mean, they continue to influence America's story right up to the present day.
It's amazing to think about how these events from centuries ago are still shaping our world today. This deep dive has been really eye-opening, to say the least.
It really challenges us to question these simplified narratives that we've often been told about America's past. It encourages us to dig deeper, to embrace those complexities and to confront those uncomfortable truths.
To look beyond the surface and really grapple with those messy realities.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. It's about choices. It's about the legacies that continue to shape our world today.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been truly enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to think about, plenty to contemplate as they, continue to explore these intertwined histories.
Yeah. I encourage everyone to take a closer look at those individuals whose stories we've discussed today, the Acadians, Lady Isabel Hamilton, Millie Francis.
Yeah.
Their experiences give us this glimpse into the very human side of these monumental historical events, and they remind us that the quest for peace, freedom, and justice is a journey that continues to this day.
A journey with plenty of twists and turns and aha moments along the way. Thanks for being our guide on this historical adventure. And to our listeners, as always, keep diving deeper. We'll see you on the next deep dive.